Honora Blackwood was 41 years old when she watched the sheriff nail a foreclosure notice to the door of the smithy her husband had built with his own hands, and understood, in that same breath, that she was about to become a woman with nothing. The man who signed the paper that ruined her was Silas Crane, president of the Cinder Bluff Trust, and the very partner her husband had once trusted with half ownership of the forge, who called to a note Honora had never seen and could not disprove. With only $14 left to her name, she paid 6 of them at a county sale for a collapsed,
How much for the
ash-blackened
abandoned
blacksmith
smithy?
shop
I
on the
offer
far edge of
$6.
town that had stood empty and
Sold for
unclaimed since its
$6.
last owner vanished under a cloud of suspicion
20
nearly
years
20
ago,
years
he
before.
just vanished
A
into the
purchase
night.
the whole of Cinder Bluff, Kansas, called the surest proof yet that grief had finally broken her sense. They did not know that behind its great brick chimney, sealed away since before most of them were born, waited a forgotten map that would not only return to Honora everything she had lost, but would settle a debt the whole town had been quietly living inside of for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Honora Blackwood. If you are watching this from a place the world has already decided is finished, tell us in the comments, because this story was written with you in mind. Honora had been born Honora Vane in the spring of 1843, the only surviving daughter of a Pennsylvania-born blacksmith named Elias Vane, who had followed the promise of good iron ore and cheap land out to the Kansas Territory when Honora was still a girl small enough to ride the whole way perched on a wagon seat between her parents. Elias was not a demonstrative man, but he loved his daughter in the particular way of craftsmen who show affection through instruction, and by the time Honora was 10, she could already work the bellows steadily enough to keep a fire at the exact heat her father needed, and by 14 she could judge, simply by the color of glowing iron, whether it was ready to be shaped or needed another turn in the coals. Elias believed, and taught his daughter to believe alongside him, that the forge revealed a person's character as plainly as any pulpit, since iron worked in haste split and cracked under the hammer, while iron worked with patience and a steady, attentive hand could be coaxed into almost any shape a smith required, strong enough to outlast the very man who made it. Honora's mother, Prudence Vane, died of a fever when Honora was 12, and in the years that followed, the girl became, in practice if never in formal name, her father's true apprentice, the one steady presence at the forge through the long Kansas winters and the brutal open-fire summers both, learning not only the craft of iron but the particular discipline of running a small business honestly, of extending fair credit to struggling homesteaders and refusing, even when money was tight, to cut corners on the strength of a plow blade or a wagon axle that some family's whole harvest might depend upon. Elias Vane had lost his own father to a foundry accident back in Pennsylvania before he ever learned the trade properly himself, and it was perhaps this early loss that made him so exacting with Honora, so determined that his daughter understand every danger and every discipline of the forge before he trusted her with anything more demanding than working the bellows, since he had seen firsthand what carelessness around fire and iron could cost a family. He often told her, in the plain, unhurried way he told her most things, that a smith who feared the forge properly would outlive a smith who merely respected it, and that the difference between the two was measured not in courage but in attention, in the small, careful habits that kept a person's fingers whole and a shop's customers well served across a lifetime of honest work. Honora carried that lesson forward long after her father's own hands grew too unsteady to hold a hammer, understanding it not merely as forge wisdom, but as a broader philosophy for facing any danger, financial or otherwise, that life might eventually set before her. It was at her father's forge that Honora first met Thomas Blackwood, a serious, broad-shouldered young man who arrived in Cinder Bluff at 19 looking for smithing work, and who possessed, Elias noted approvingly within his first week, the rare patience of a natural craftsman rather than a man merely passing time until something better came along. Thomas courted Honora slowly and respectfully over the better part of 2 years, and when Elias's own health began failing in his later years, it was Thomas who took over the heaviest work of the forge without ever once making Honora feel as though her own long apprenticeship had been rendered unnecessary by his arrival, a quality Honora came to treasure above nearly any other in the marriage that followed their wedding in 1865. Together, Honora and Thomas built the Blackwood smithy into the most trusted forge in the county, Honora keeping the accounts and managing the steady stream of customers with the same careful eye her father had trained in her, while Thomas grew the shop's reputation for wheel rims and plow blades strong enough to survive Kansas winters. That broke lesser iron within a single season. They raised 3 children in the rooms above the smithy, 2 sons who grew and moved further west to try their own fortunes, and a daughter who married into a ranching family 2 counties over. And though the years brought their share of lean winters and one devastating grasshopper plague that nearly ruined half the county's farmers along with the smithy's customer base, Honora and Thomas weathered each hardship together with the same patient steadiness Elias Vane had first modeled at his own forge decades before. It was in the year 1879 that Thomas, seeking capital to expand the smithy into a proper foundry capable of casting larger implements the growing county increasingly demanded, took on a business partner named Silas Crane, a smooth, ambitious man who had recently arrived in Cinder Bluff to establish its first proper bank, and who offered Thomas a generous loan in exchange for a minority stake in the smithy's future profits. Honora had never entirely trusted Crane's easy charm, the particular way his compliments seemed calculated rather than felt, but Thomas, ever inclined to see the best in a fellow tradesman, dismissed her private reservations as an old woman's caution, and the partnership proceeded on terms that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable to everyone involved. The foundry expansion succeeded beyond even Thomas's hopeful projections, and for nearly 4 years the Blackwood smithy prospered as never before, until Thomas's heart failed him suddenly one autumn morning while hefting a length of iron rail, leaving Honora a widow at 40 with a thriving business, a partnership agreement she had never been permitted to review in detail, and no earthly notion of the trouble that oversight was about to bring down upon her. Silas Crane arrived at the smithy within days of Thomas's funeral, his manner carrying all its usual polish but none of its former warmth, informing Honora that the original partnership agreement, a document Thomas had apparently signed without Honora's knowledge granting Crane considerable authority over the business in the event of Thomas's death, entitled Crane to assume full operational control of the smithy immediately, with Honora retained, if she wished, only in the diminished capacity of a hired bookkeeper. Honora demanded to see the original document, and Crane produced it smoothly, too smoothly. The signature unmistakably Thomas's own, but the terms themselves written in a dense legal hand that bore little resemblance to the plain, straightforward agreements Thomas had always favored in his other dealings. Terms that granted Crane, in the event of Thomas's incapacity or death, the right to call due the full remaining balance of the original loan at his sole discretion. Honora argued that Thomas would never knowingly have signed away such control over a business he and Honora had built together across 17 years of marriage, and Crane, his composure never fully cracking but his patience visibly thinning, reminded her that a grieving widow's memory of her late husband's business dealings held very little weight against a properly witnessed legal document. Within 6 weeks, Crane called the loan due in full, a sum Honora could not possibly raise on short notice, and the smithy, along with the tools her father had once used to teach her the language of iron, passed into Crane's sole possession at a foreclosure sale where he himself was, unsurprisingly, the only bidder. Honora did not surrender her claim without a fight, however limited her options proved to be. She wrote, in the weeks before the foreclosure sale, to a territorial attorney in Topeka whose name a sympathetic neighbor supplied her, describing the suspicious terms of the partnership document and asking whether any legal challenge might delay Crane's claim long enough for her to raise the necessary funds through the sale of household goods or an appeal to distant relatives. The attorney's reply, when it finally arrived, offered little comfort, explaining that without clear evidence of fraud beyond her own suspicion, a properly witnessed document would very likely stand in any territorial court, and that pursuing such a challenge would require funds Honora did not possess merely to file the necessary paperwork. It was a bitter lesson in the particular helplessness of a woman whose entire adult competence had been built around iron and honest ledgers rather than the tangled language of legal documents, and Honora absorbed it the way her father had once taught her to absorb the heat of the forge, without flinching outwardly, whatever it cost her privately to bear. Honora Blackwood found herself, at 41 years old, standing outside the very building where she had spent her entire adult life, with $14 in her coin purse, the clothes on her back, and a small leather satchel containing her father's original apprenticeship certificate and a modest set of hand tools too worn and personal for Crane to have bothered claiming. Several of her old customers, farmers whose plow blades she had helped fit and mend for decades, offered quiet sympathy but little practical help, since Crane's bank now held the note on nearly every farm in the county, and few families felt they could risk his displeasure by openly siding with the widow he had so thoroughly dispossessed. Honora considered, briefly, following her daughter to the ranching country 2 counties over, but something stubborn in her, some inherited certainty that a craftsman does not abandon her trade simply because one dishonest partner has stolen the forge, kept her rooted in Cinder Bluff through that difficult autumn. Taking in mending work and the occasional small ironwork job that Crane's control of the smithy could not entirely prevent her from performing out of a borrowed shed behind the boarding house where she now let a room. It was at the county courthouse, inquiring after any legal recourse she might still pursue against Crane's foreclosure, that Honora first heard mention of the old Tillman Forge, a blacksmith shop on the far northern edge of town that had stood abandoned for nearly 2 decades, ever since its original owner, a freedman and master smith named Ambrose Tillman, had disappeared from Cinder Bluff under circumstances the town's older residents still discussed only in careful, uncertain whispers. The county, weary of the derelict property sitting unclaimed on its tax rolls, intended to auction it that very week for whatever anyone would offer, and Honora, walking the half-mile north to see the building for herself, found a structure that looked exactly as forsaken as its reputation suggested. Its roof collapsed entirely on one side, its walls scorched black with decades of accumulated soot, its great brick chimney, easily the largest and finest she had ever seen on any forge in the county, standing improbably solid amid the general ruin around it. When the auctioneer opened bidding at the courthouse steps 2 days later, no one else in the gathered crowd, which included several who had come merely to watch Silas Crane's continued rise with the same detached curiosity they might have shown a particularly dramatic church sermon, offered so much as a whisper of interest, and Honora's bid of $6 drew a ripple of unkind laughter through the assembled onlookers, several of whom murmured that the poor widow Blackwood had clearly lost whatever good sense her father had once instilled in her. Honora signed the deed with a steady hand despite the laughter, and walked north that same afternoon to survey what she had purchased with something closer to her father's old assessing eye than to the despair the townsfolk clearly expected of her, noting, even amid the ruin, that the chimney's brickwork displayed a level of craftsmanship far beyond what an ordinary frontier smithy required, its flue drawing true despite 2 decades of neglect, its foundation set deeper and more carefully than the collapsed walls around it seemed to warrant. She spent her first days at the old Tillman Forge simply clearing enough space to work, hauling away rotted timber and shattered brick from the collapsed portion of the roof, and it was on her 4th day, while she was inspecting the chimney's base to judge whether its foundation might support rebuilding the rest of the structure around it, running her hands along the brickwork the way her father had once taught her to test iron for hidden flaws, that her fingers found a section of mortar between 2 bricks near the chimney's rear face that gave slightly under pressure, unlike the solid, weathered mortar surrounding it, as though it had been repointed at some point long after the original construction and never quite matched the surrounding work. Honora worked that loose section free with a small chisel in her bare, patient hands, and found, in a shallow cavity built into the chimney's very structure, a slim iron box no larger than a hymnal, its surface pitted with rust, but it seemed still tight enough to have kept its contents dry across 2 decades of Kansas weather. She carried the box back to the borrowed shed where she still did her mending work, and pried it open that evening by lamplight to find, wrapped in oiled leather gone stiff with age, a folded document that proved, upon careful unfolding, to be both a letter and a hand-drawn map, the ink faded but legible, the paper marked at its corners with small burn scorches that suggested it had once been kept very close to a working forge indeed. The letter, written in a careful, deliberate hand, identified itself immediately as the work of Ambrose Tillman, and it took Honora the better part of that first night, reading and rereading by lamplight, to understand the full weight of what she was holding. Tillman's letter explained that he had come to Cinder Bluff in the years just after the war, a freedman and trained smith who had built, through years of honest, skilled labor, the very forge whose ruined chimney now stood before Honora, and that he had become, over more than a decade of work, one of the most trusted craftsmen in the county, respected by white and black settlers alike for the uncommon quality of his iron work. The letter went on to describe how, in the year 1863, during the chaotic border violence that had plagued Kansas throughout the war years, a group of Union sympathizers passing through the territory had entrusted Tillman, whose forge sat conveniently along a lesser-used route north, with a considerable sum of gold coin meant to fund the establishment of a school and relief fund for the county's growing population of freed and freeborn black families, asking him to hold the money safely until peace returned and a proper trustee could be established to administer it honestly. Honora understood, reading these details, that Tillman's forge in its working years had stood as something rare and precious in that particular corner of Kansas, a place where the ordinary hierarchies of the era briefly gave way before the plain, undeniable evidence of a craftsman's skill, where farmers who might otherwise have looked past a black tradesman's shop found themselves returning again and again because no other smith in 3 counties could match the quality of his work. It was precisely this hard-won respect, Tillman's letter suggested with a bitterness he otherwise worked hard to restrain, that had made the rumors spread against him all the more devastating, since a man who had built his standing so carefully through honest labor found that standing could be unmade in a matter of weeks by whispers requiring no proof at all, only the willingness of frightened, suspicious neighbors to believe the worst of a man whose success had never entirely stopped making some of them uneasy. Tillman's letter described, in painful and precise detail, how he had waited years for such a trustee to be named, corresponding patiently with sympathetic officials in the territorial capital, only to watch the promised relief fund become entangled in bureaucratic delay after bureaucratic delay, until a local land speculator, an aspiring politician named Reuben Ashcroft, catching wind of the hidden gold through a careless remark Tillman had made in confidence to a supposed friend, began spreading rumors throughout Cinder Bluff that the respected blacksmith was secretly hoarding stolen Union funds for his own private enrichment. The accusation, however baseless, found fertile ground in a county still raw from wartime suspicion and increasingly hostile toward its black residents as Reconstruction's early promises curdled into bitter backlash, and Tillman's letter recounted, in a hand that grew visibly less steady across its final paragraphs, threats made against his life and his family should he not immediately surrender the location of the supposed hoard. Rather than risk his family's safety by revealing gold that was never his to surrender in the first place, gold meant for the very community now turning against him, Tillman had sealed the map to its hiding place within his own chimney, the one part of his forge he trusted no mob would think to tear apart in their haste, and fled north with his wife and children under cover of darkness, leaving behind everything he had built rather than see his family harmed over a fortune that was never truly his own to claim. Honora sat with that letter for the better part of a day, understanding slowly the full shape of the injustice it described, that a skilled and honorable craftsman had been driven from his own home and his own life's work not for any wrongdoing of his own, but for the crime of having been trusted with something valuable while being, in the eyes of a hostile county, the wrong kind of man to trust with anything at all. The map itself, once Honora studied it carefully against her own growing knowledge of the surrounding countryside, indicated a location along a dry creek bed some 3 miles north of town, marked with a small symbol Tillman's letter identified as a cairn of stones he had built himself to mark the spot, a cairn Honora suspected, given 20 years of prairie weather, might well have weathered away entirely by now, leaving the gold's exact location considerably harder to pinpoint than Tillman's careful map might have originally suggested. She did not rush toward that creek bed with any thought of simply claiming the gold for herself, understanding, with the same patient instinct her father had taught her at the forge, that a fortune found through another man's stolen trust required considerably more care in its handling than an ordinary discovery might. Instead, through the following weeks, Even as she began the slow work of clearing the old Tillman forge and quietly re-establishing herself as a working smith in the borrowed shed behind the boarding house, Honora spent her evenings researching what she could of Ambrose Tillman's history and the fate of the relief fund he had been entrusted to protect, writing careful letters to the Territorial Archive in Topeka, requesting whatever surviving records might document the original wartime pledge and the identities of the Union sympathizers who had first entrusted Tillman with the gold. It was slow, uncertain work, made harder by the passage of 2 full decades and the general reluctance of county records from that chaotic period to have survived intact. But Honora persisted with the same patient thoroughness her father had once brought to judging the readiness of glowing iron, refusing to let her own understandable eagerness rush her into acting before she understood fully what she had found and what justice, properly done, might require of her. It was Delphine Ruiz, an elderly woman who had once worked as a laundress for several of the county's founding families and who remembered, better than almost anyone still living in Cinder Bluff, the particular ugliness of the rumors spread against Ambrose Tillman 2 decades before, who first grew curious about Honora's quiet questions regarding the old Tillman forge. And it was Delphine, entirely without malicious intent, who mentioned the widow Blackwood's inquiries to a mutual acquaintance, in a manner that eventually reached Silas Crane himself, a man whose ears, it seemed, remained finely attuned to any activity in Cinder Bluff that might affect his own considerable interests. Crane arrived at Honora's borrowed shed on a raw winter afternoon, his manner carrying its usual polished courtesy, but an unmistakable undertone of calculation, informing Honora that he had heard she was investigating old rumors about hidden gold near the abandoned Tillman property, and offering, with a generosity that struck Honora as entirely out of character, to purchase the old forge property from her outright at a price considerably higher than the $6 she had originally paid for it, an offer Honora recognized immediately for what it truly was, an attempt by a shrewd businessman to secure for himself whatever fortune he suspected might be connected to that ruined chimney before Honora could fully understand its value herself. Honora declined Crane's offer with the same steady composure she had once brought to negotiating fair credit terms with struggling homesteaders at her father's forge, and Crane's courteous mask slipped just enough, in that moment, to reveal a flash of genuine frustration, a reaction that told Honora more plainly than any words could have exactly how much he suspected without yet fully knowing. Word of Crane's interest in the old Tillman property spread through Cinder Bluff within days, as such things inevitably did, and the wider town, already inclined to view Honora's purchase of the ruined forge as evidence of grief-addled foolishness, now added a fresh layer of suspicion, wondering aloud whether the widow Blackwood had stumbled onto some genuine treasure or was merely the latest pawn in one of Silas Crane's increasingly transparent schemes to expand his considerable holdings throughout the county. Several of Honora's few remaining friends in town grew cautious in her company, uncertain whether associating with her invited Crane's displeasure, and Honora found herself once again facing the particular isolation of a woman whose circumstances the town found easier to gossip about than to genuinely assist. Not everyone in Cinder Bluff proved willing to let Crane's suspicion of Honora go entirely unchallenged. However, for a young farmer named Gideon Marsh, whose father's plow blades Honora had mended faithfully for years without ever once shorting him on quality, despite his family's frequent inability to pay promptly, began quietly speaking up on her behalf whenever talk turned unkind at the feed store or the church social, reminding his neighbors plainly that whatever else might be said of the widow Blackwood, she had never once, in all his family's dealings with her, given them cause to doubt her honesty. Gideon's steady, unglamorous loyalty did not silence the town's gossip entirely, but it gave Honora something she badly needed in those uncertain weeks, the quiet knowledge that her years of patient, honest work had left at least some mark of trust in Cinder Bluff that Crane's maneuvering could not entirely erase. What finally allowed Honora to move forward with confidence was a reply that arrived from the Territorial Archive in Topeka after nearly 2 months of patient waiting, confirming that a wartime relief fund pledge matching Tillman's description had indeed been recorded in 1863, funded by a coalition of Union sympathizers and abolitionist societies specifically for the establishment of schools and relief services for Kansas's freed and freeborn black population, a pledge that had, according to the surviving correspondence, been entrusted to a local intermediary whose name the records listed simply as A. Tillman, Blacksmith, Cinder Bluff, before all further record of the fund's disposition simply ceased, precisely matching the abrupt disappearance Tillman's own letter had described. Honora carried this confirmation, along with Tillman's original letter and map, not to Silas Crane but to Judge Everett Kilbride, the circuit judge who presided over the county's civil matters and who possessed, Honora had learned through careful inquiry, a reputation for genuine fairness uncommon among the territory's judiciary. Judge Kilbride, reviewing the assembled evidence with the same careful deliberation Honora herself had brought to every step of her investigation, agreed that the matter warranted a proper accounting, and dispatched a small party, Honora among them, to the dry creek bed Tillman's map had indicated, where, after several hours of careful searching among weathered stones that had indeed scattered considerably over 2 decades, they located a heavy iron cache buried beneath what remained of Tillman's original cairn, containing gold coin whose value, once properly assessed, proved substantial enough to fund considerably more than the modest school and relief fund originally envisioned. The formal hearing that followed, held in Cinder Bluff's largest meeting hall because word of the discovery had spread throughout the county within days, drew a crowd unlike anything the town had witnessed in years, and it was there that Judge Kilbride read aloud the full account of Ambrose Tillman's wrongful persecution, the baseless accusations that had driven an honest, skilled craftsman from his home and his livelihood, and the town's own collective failure, 2 decades earlier, to extend him the basic fairness his character and years of honest service had plainly earned. A heavy silence settled over that hall as the county's older residents, several of whom Honora recognized as having been among the very voices that once spread suspicion against Tillman, confronted the plain truth of what their community's prejudice had cost a good man and his family. Judge Kilbride ruled that the recovered gold be placed in trust for its originally intended purpose, the establishment of a school and relief fund, with a portion set aside specifically to be offered to Ambrose Tillman himself or his surviving descendants, should they ever be located, as both restitution and formal acknowledgement of the wrong done to him. Honora could have claimed, in that moment, a considerable finder's reward for herself, and Judge Kilbride himself gently suggested she was entitled to exactly that after everything her own patient investigation had accomplished. Instead, standing before the gathered town in the same plain work dress she had worn to bid $6 on a ruined blacksmith shop months before, Honora asked only that a portion of the recovered fortune be used to rebuild the old Tillman forge exactly as its original craftsman had built it, restored as a working smithy and named formally in his honor, with Honora herself serving as its keeper until such time as Tillman or his descendants might be found and welcomed home to reclaim what had always rightfully been theirs. It was, the town would say for years afterward, a request that revealed more about her character than any speech could have managed, and it was that quiet, deliberate generosity, more than the discovery itself, that finally turned Cinder Bluff's uncertain gossip into something like genuine reckoning with its own past failures. In the months that followed, letters sent by Honora and Judge Kilbride both to black communities throughout Kansas and neighboring territories eventually located a branch of the Tillman family settled in Nicodemus, the thriving black settlement further west, where Ambrose Tillman himself, now an old man, but still remarkably steady of hand, had continued his craft in relative peace for nearly 2 decades, never once speaking to his own children of the gold he had protected and lost, believing it long since claimed by whatever mob had driven him from Cinder Bluff. The school that rose from the recovered fund, a modest but sturdy building erected on land donated by the county once Judge Kilbride's ruling made plain the moral weight of the matter, was dedicated that following spring in a ceremony Honora attended alongside Gideon Marsh and Delphine Ruiz both, the very neighbors whose quiet loyalty had steadied her through the hardest weeks of suspicion, and it was decided, at Honora's own gentle suggestion, that the school bear a small plaque naming Ambrose Tillman as its founding benefactor, so that no child who passed beneath its doorway in the years to come would grow up ignorant of the debt the whole county owed to a man it had once so grievously wronged. His reunion with the restored forge that bore his name, and his quiet, tearful recognition of the very chimney he had built with his own hands so many years before, became, in the retelling that spread throughout the county in the years that followed, the story Cinderbluff most wished to be remembered for, rather than the shameful rumors that had once driven a good man from his home. Silas Crane, his attempted scheme to claim the property exposed before the entire county, found his standing considerably diminished in the seasons that followed, and though he retained his bank and much of his fortune, he never again commanded the same easy deference from Cinderbluff's residents that had once allowed him to seize a grieving widow's smithy without meaningful objection. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, that Honora Blackwood stood outside her own family's forge with $14 and a small satchel of her father's tools, cast out by a partner who believed a widow's memory of her husband's honest dealings carried no weight against a cleverly worded document. She spent $6 of those dollars on a ruined blacksmith shop the whole town had long since written off as beyond any sensible use, because some deep, inherited instinct, passed down from a father who taught her to read the true strength of iron beneath its rough surface, told her that very little in this world is truly finished simply because it has been abandoned. Behind that great brick chimney waited not a fortune meant for her alone, but the long-delayed restoration of a good man's stolen name and stolen trust. And in choosing to restore Ambrose Tillman's forge and his history rather than claim his fortune for herself, Honora proved that the truest measure of a craftsman, whether working iron or working justice, lies not in what she claims for herself, but in what she is willing to build honestly for others. She often said, in later years, whenever a visitor asked how a widow with only $14 had managed to uncover what an entire county had overlooked for 2 decades, that she had simply done what her father taught her to do with any piece of iron whose true strength was not immediately visible, which was to test it patiently, without assuming its worth or its worthlessness from a single hurried glance. Honora Blackwood remained at the restored Tillman Forge for the rest of her working years, serving as its keeper and continuing its tradition of honest, patient craftsmanship exactly as both her own father and Ambrose Tillman had once practiced it. And though she never again possessed great wealth, she wanted for nothing that truly mattered, respected at last throughout the county not as a grieving widow to be pitied, but as the woman whose patient hands had uncovered a hidden fortune and used it to give an entire community back a piece of the honest history it had so nearly let disappear forever. Before you click away, remember this: the world almost let Honora's story disappear forever, but today, you helped bring it back to life. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that being forgotten is never the end of the story. You never know whose perspective it could change. Now it's your turn. Have you ever discovered something, or someone, that everyone else had already given up on, only to realize its true value later? Tell us your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your experience might inspire thousands of others. And if you love powerful true stories, forgotten history, and unbelievable discoveries that deserve to be remembered, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because our next story may be even more astonishing than this one, and you won't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones hidden from the world, they're the ones the world stopped looking for. Stay curious, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next story.